dozens of victims who were overseas. Now, they had 80 individuals that were indicted. Dozens of those were arrested in LA and here in the United States. Many of them will have to be extradited, and most of them were Nigerian nationals, and they'll be charged with money laundering, fraud, identity theft. But you guys, unfortunately, even with the charges and the investigation that led to those charges, those victims
in manufacturing for the first time in nearly a decade, and we've learned job growth earlier this year was not as good as first reported. ABC's Jonathan Karl asked President Trump about it.
Mr. President, are you concerned about the jobs numbers, the revision, 500,000 fewer jobs over the past
No, the
year?
job numbers have been really good. We have unemployment at a level that it hasn't been at for many, many years. Fantastic numbers. The economy has been really fantastic.
Officials say the White House is not considering any immediate action to boost the economy, but they say a tax cut for the middle class may be proposed during the 2020 presidential campaign. President Trump leaves for the G7 summit today, where forested land have been cleared while several fires are smoldering nearby. Brazil's president says his country needs help fighting these fires, but a U.S. senator blames the Brazilian government for allowing ranchers and farmers to set fires to clear the land. Senator Brian Schatz of Hawaii says all U.S. aid to Brazil should be suspended until that country stops encouraging the deforestation. At the DNC summer meeting in San Francisco, Senator Elizabeth Warren is already making waves, criticizing more moderate candidates at a DNC gala for advocating tweaks and nudges instead of big structural change.
Now, some Democrats in Washington believe the only way forward is to make change incrementally. A few tweaks here, some nudges there. No, this is a time of crisis. And when you are in crisis, when your back is up against the wall, the last thing you do is back down from the big fights. So I'm here tonight with a message for Democrats. This is not the time for small ideas.
So in Dayton, tackling gun violence is one of the biggest issues lawmakers are under increased pressure to address.
We've got to look at this in a holistic manner, and at the same time do it in a way that we don't violate constitutional rights.
Congressman Gary Palmer tells me we need to gain a better understanding of what's causing people to commit violent acts and address needs in areas like mental health care.
We've got to do a much better job on the mental health side, and we've got to look at what's going on in the culture of the breakdown of the family. If you look at most of these rampage attacks in the United States, most of them are involved young white males from dysfunctional families or broken homes, and in many cases they're involved with medications of certain types, psychotropic drugs.
Congressman Palmer says expanded background checks should be explored, but added those laws have to be better enforced. I asked him about red flag laws, and he says while lawmakers are looking at that as an option, he believes it really should be left to the states.
If we go in that direction with a red flag law, we've got to protect people from false accusations. At the same time, you got to protect individuals under the Fourth Amendment to their right to be secure in their persons, their papers, their houses, their possessions, and that any effort to deprive them of that has to be done with a warrant that is sworn to.
Congressman Palmer also pointed to a bipartisan bill he's co-sponsoring called the TAPS Act, or the Threat Assessment, Protection, and Safety Act, as another piece of addressing this. He says it would take protocols already in place at some federal agencies and help local and state law enforcement understand how to use those to better identify and assess potential threats.
It would be a state initiative. The federal government would provide the funding either through a block grant or an appropriation that would allow states to get this training. The Capitol Police, for instance, that's what they use. So I think that we've got to rethink how we do a lot of this stuff.
Aggressive anti-government protesters broke the delicate peace of the past week, building barricades and advancing on a police line in the residential district of Chunwan Sunday. All warnings were ignored.
Riot police have now engaged with the protesters. They've been firing rounds and rounds of tear gas. The protesters in very close proximity just behind me. They are throwing bricks and they are protecting themselves with umbrellas.
In a first for Hong Kong, police also deployed 2 water cannons, firing at barricades and protesters, but no one was hit. Throughout the night, protesters fanned out across the district of Kowloon in a cat-and-mouse chase with police. And in one worrying sign, officers being chased by an angry mob pulled their handguns and fired a warning shot before the group retreated. One greater looming fear, if Hong Kong becomes too violent, Beijing might deploy troops to pacify the city.
Last weekend was like being in the eye of the hurricane. Today, after a peaceful march broke up, a war broke out again. On the streets of densely populated eastern Kowloon, Hong Kong's period of calm is over. Protesters hurling shards of concrete, poles and Molotov cocktails at riot police, and tear gas canisters clattering down. Clouds of it hung in the humid afternoon air for hours. If China had hoped these protests would just fizzle out, its ruling Communist Party's got another thing coming. All this now playing out on TV screens from Beijing to Biarritz.
So, this is a bit of an embarrassing beginning to the G7 summit, with all those world leaders watching, and Xi Jinping might no doubt in China watching too. A standoff with a special tactical unit outside a Hong Kong shopping mall. Okay, come this way.
Protesters who'd retreated into the mall rained their fury on the police down below. This time, a cluster unit releasing 5 separate tear gas munitions detonated over police too slow to get masks on. A local resident single-handedly confronted the police. "I live here," he yelled. He mocked the cops. "You're not as tough as you think you are," he said. Other local spectators crowded onto a balcony, armed with smartphones.
Stay back. Excuse me.
A man who tried to stop the protesters from throwing stuff is hauled off. He tries to reason with the police and urges them to pull back. I would later bump into him. His name's Lai Kim Tak. He's a construction worker. Eventually, the situation calmed as the protesters vaporized like water. It's obviously pretty exhausting being a Hong Kong cop in this long, long, hot summer. Trust in these men is wearing thin now. To protesters, they are defending the indefensible and now represent the iron fist of authoritarian China.
If this last stronghold of open society would lose grip to the dictatorship in Beijing, this represents a fall of modern civilization. This is the last stronghold. Hong Kong people are standing up for the liberty and democracy.
Nearby, Mr. Lai was taking a rest. He told me how he puts himself in harm's way to stop violence. I asked him, though, whether he supported the young people. Of course, he said. This is happening 20 years too late. Down the road, the riot police were regrouping under the direct command of 2 senior Hong Kong policemen, both British, accused by protesters of doing Beijing's dirty work.
Are you able to tell me what's going on?
You'll be seeing me in a minute, sir.
This is Chief Inspector David Jordan, a former Royal Naval officer. He speaks Cantonese. And this is Superintendent Justin Shave. They're 2 of the most prominent Brits among 50 expats in the 32,000-strong force and have been targeted in vitriolic cyber attacks for their roles here. Running battles continued long into the night. What will Beijing do? Its party leaders say this cannot go on, but it does, and there'll likely be more tomorrow.